I am very happy to be with you all in this third part of this talk on my book, this book called India, A Cultural Decline or Revival, which you see on the screen, just literally inverted. Anyway, yes, there it is. This is the book, and this was written many years ago, but the issues in this book are the permanent issues in the last 50 years of our culture and the cultural life of India. Now, this third talk today is on the later part of my book, in which I deal with the issues of language, identity, and how the issues of language and identity go to make some kind of a nationalism or contradict nationalism and reassert what may be called regionalism or fissiparous tendencies. So this is and then there is the association of religion along with this. So it is a complicated subject, but it is a subject which has been really live and hot for last 100 years. So let us begin the talk. Let me begin, as I always try to do, with an auspicious shloka, and I read out something to you. Ganga taranga ramaniya jata kalapam gauri nirantara vibhushita vama bhagam Narayana Priyamananga Madapaharam Varanasi Purapatim Bhaja Vishwanatham Varanasi Purapatim Bhaja Vishwanatham. Now friends, language is looked upon very differently in different parts of culture. In different parts of the world, people look upon language in many different ways. In India, we have a very specific way of looking at language. We connect it to our communication not only with each other, but our communication with other creatures in this world, and also with those powers which are the powers of creation. So language for us is a means of communicating not only with our fellow human beings, but with the ultimate reality, the maker of this world. And that is why language in India has been divided into four: para, pashyanti, madhyama and vaikhari. What we normally know as language is vaikhari. That is something which is split into different parts, and which is known as the language of the tongue, or glossa as they call it in Greek, glossa, that which is spoken through the mouth. Now that is the lowest level of it, and that is always specific to a region, a people, a time, etc. But beyond that, there is the language within the mind, construction of what is in your mind, and then your consciousness, how that consciousness is related to the highest level of consciousness or the creator. Now, how does this differ from the concept of language as we see in the West? Normally, the West looks upon language as something which belongs to a people, represents the cultural life of a people, and represents their identity. You see, for Europeans particularly, language is the essential basis. It is the cornerstone of making the identity of a people. Now that is not the position in India. In India, as I just told you, there are many aspects of this language. There is the verbal language, there is the language of sign, there is the language of music, there is the language of color, there is the language of birds, animals, clouds, nature, mountains, volcanoes, shabda, nada. We have many words which express something which is not just the dictionary meaning. Shabda or a nada or sound in the Indian context is not just the dictionary sound, like a word from the dictionary, like say a word in Sanskrit, like shwan for dog. In English you have dog, in Hindi you have kutta. So these are different words, but they mean the same thing. But in the Indian context, language is related not just to the dictionary meaning, but also to the widest possible nature of sound, because the sound emerges itself in tones also, swara, in pitch, in volume, and then how it is spoken or how it is rendered, whether by a human being or by another living being or by a musical instrument. So all this fineness is seen in terms of expression in India, and identity of a person or the idea to communicate is not restricted just to a dictionary. Therefore, what is normally considered in the West as language, which is English language, French language, German language, is not the same thing as Tamil language, Kannada language, Hindi, Bengali, etc. That of course is one aspect of the dictionary language of the Vyakta Shabda, that which is very specific, that which is laid out in the dictionary. But beyond that, there are so many other levels and aspects of language, and India has been using it for communication consciously and along with the dictionary meaning. So, this is not a small thing, because when you come to make your identity, and if you choose your identity as if it is restricted to something which is in the dictionary, like a particular given language like Hindi or Bengali or Tamil, then you say, well, this is the language. But when you include in that music, when the word is combined with music, and that is also the language that you speak, when you combine your various kinds of intentions, rise and fall of the voice, the nature of the voice, and your gestures, how you move your hands, what are your facial expressions along with that language. When communication for you is all that put together, then you just can't say that my language is only the words that I am speaking. So in India, use of language is never just in the dictionary meaning level or what is called abhidhartha. It is at the level of music, at the level of gesture, and we include the language of painting in the medium of communication. Now, that has been used in India right from the very earliest times to communicate, to conduct something. And that is part of our cultural history. Therefore, we think of language, we have used language through these thousands of years in a very different manner from how the Europeans have used. Of course, the Europeans have used music along with words, they have used painting and color and all those things. But then, they have not combined those various aspects of communication into one single whole as we have done in India. And we have been doing it from the earliest time. If you look at the Rig Veda, then the Rig Veda was not just the word, not just the mantra, Agnimide Purohitam. It was not just chanting, but it was also singing the Vedas, the Saman chant, and using it in action. So communication was just something much more than reading, let us say, a portion of the Bible or reading a portion of the Old Testament. It was with so many things other than just the written word. This is what I want you to bear in mind, because this is what has been making our cultural identity. That is why we have considered this language, this spoken language, as only one part of communication and one part of making of our identity. I repeat now that for Europe, the dictionary language or the spoken vaikhari, what we call vaikhari, is what makes their identity. If you go to modern Europe today, then you would find, even now, in spite of the European Union, the area divided into various nations. And it has been so for the last 400 or 500 years. Now this modern nationalism came into being, so to speak, ever since books came into print. And books became very popular, so that people of Europe could see that their language circulated in a certain area. And then they chose that area, that territory in which their language circulated, and they made their nation out of it. So, when they discovered that French is spoken in this part of Europe, which was earlier partly Gaul and partly Saxony and partly, various other, then they said, okay, now this much part will be called the French nation. Or when they said, okay, here is where German language is spoken, and this is the region where different states speak a language similar to standard German, that the standardized German, and Bismarck made a nation called Germany. So it was on the basis of language that in Europe modern nations were born. So modern nations in India is something which we don't think in the same manner as they think of in Europe. Because we have had always a highly multicultural society in which people spoke all kinds of different languages. And we never identified ourselves entirely with one language. We were always multilingual people. In ancient times, what is wrongly called Sanskrit drama, in ancient drama, people used to speak in 4 or 5 languages. It was a multilingual drama. So some characters would speak in Sanskrit, like the king. The queen would speak in some regional language like Magadhi or Saurashtri. Some other characters who came from the south would speak a language of south. And they all used music and dance, and people followed, and the audience was very happy to listen to different kinds of languages. They never said, give me my drama in Hindi. I have come to see Hindi drama. I have come to see Tamil drama. I have come to see Punjabi play. You see, that kind of thing came into existence in India in the 20th century. With print culture coming into India and linguistic consciousness rising in. Otherwise, we were creating our arts according to genres, according to fashion, according to needs. For instance, if you look at what is now called Carnatic music, then people were writing compositions of Carnatic music mostly in Telugu, like Tyagaraja. Or they were writing them in Kannada. Or they were sometimes writing later on in Malayalam and even in Hindi. The great king Swati Tirunal, he made Brij Bhasha compositions in Carnatic music in what may be called part of Hindi or what was Brij Bhasha. And he never said that I am going to compose only in Malayalam. So whosoever wanted to make a composition or communicate through music would communicate through different languages. There was no such close identity. And if you read the literature of India before 18th century, in fact even in early 19th century, you will not find a single line where somebody says, I am a Tamilian, I am a Hindiya-wala, I am a Marathi. In this part of India, we are Marathis, and we don't want non-Marathis come into our region, or they should not be given the same privileges. You would never find any such sentiment, because association with the territory of a language was not an essential condition. It was very flexible. Of course, language is dominated in certain regions, and it has been very well defined for last 2000 years as to which language dominated in which part. Like Saurashtri was a language even 2000 years ago. It was spoken more than 2000 years ago. Or Magadhi was the language in the Magad or the region of Bihar, and it was different from, let us say, the language of present-day Bengal. So all that diversity existed, but people chose to use the languages as per the need. They did not make an identity of the language as they came to do later. It was in 1936 or around that time that the Congress party decided that they were going to make linguistic states in India when freedom is achieved from the British rule. So the Congress party passed a resolution and Jawaharlal Nehru moved it. And Jawaharlal Nehru was fascinated by the idea of making linguistic states after the pattern of the European Union. You see, it was a European Union example which he brought into India. And then you all know that from 1952 onwards, slowly and slowly, the present Indian linguistic states started emerging. And now, for almost 65 years in our nation, we have India as a federation or as a union of different regions or states or linguistic provinces. You see, we don't think now in terms of the country as just north, south, east, west, center, or in terms of directions only. We don't name things that way either. We always name things according to a linguistic region. And our states have a linguistic identity. And we have now, most of the time, quarrels about territory. When some people say this territory should become part of Maharashtra and not of Karnataka because there are more Marathi speakers here. We have had such controversies at different times. So, this is a reality which has come into existence as a result of following the European model. And because this is against the very nature of our tradition, of our values, and how we live, and how we think of ourselves, therefore, it has created an unreality within the total reality of India. You see, the reality of India is something else. The reality of India is that we think of this as one nation of Bharatvarsh since a long, long time. Today, it is not the theme that I talk about, the earliest references of a nation or Bharatvarsh and how Bharatvarsh was defined. But it is very well known that we were very conscious that this was one cultural unity in which the people lived. People with different kinds of languages, habits, food, etc. But they were all santati or children of this one big land. So in Vishnu Puran and various other texts, more than 1,500 years old, we have these references. We have references of Bharat or as Karma Bhumi in the Natya Shastra, which takes us back to 2,500 years old. And we have references to Bharat or the children of Bharat even in the Rig Veda. So the consciousness that this is one big land in which people are living and moving freely and thinking about it as a whole, not divided according to any linguistic divisions, is the real experience of India. Now, how is it that this experience creates problems for us in modern times? In other words, if I were to ask a question, is there something wrong with having linguistic states now? Somebody would say that, all right, Jawaharlal Nehru followed the European model, he made linguistic states out of India following the example of Europe. So it's very good, it's helping people to discover their identity, to have a regional identity, be proud of it, be active about it, to make it flourish, and at the same time keep that identity as part of the larger identity of one big nation. So what is wrong with it? Why not continue with this model? And it is at this point that I want to tell you as to how this model is not working and where this model is leading towards various kinds of clashes. I am not going to make any predictions. I am not going to suggest that this model would essentially lead to the division of the country into separate nations. I am not suggesting that it is a fait accompli, that linguistic states become into separate nations. But I will talk about a few things today as to how the complications have arisen and how the cultural development of the country is jeopardized. Now, when I say that the cultural progress of the country is jeopardized, what do I mean by it? And do I have any examples of what is happening? Yes. I'm not a man very good at statistics. And as a matter of fact, statistics regarding what I am going to talk about have not been collected. They should be collected. If some of you are interested, they should do it, and I can help you do it. I want you to become aware of one simple fact about present-day cosmopolitan India. The big cities of India like Delhi, Bombay, Calcutta, Bangalore, and not so much Chennai, but some other cities, maybe like Trivandrum, they have now a linguistic population of people from what may be called now out of state, of people from out of state going up to 20 to 30%. If you take a city like Bangalore, or Bengaluru as they now call it, I think the number of non-Kannada speaking people is even 30% or more. I mean, it's a rough guess. If statistics are collected, then we'll get an accurate picture. But this is my guess. And I think within another 10 years, the picture would radically change, and perhaps it would have more non-Kannada speaking people living in the city. Now, is this not an emerging reality? Is this not an emerging reality for Delhi also? For instance, what do you would say is the language of the people in Delhi? First of all, there would be a big controversy. Some would say Punjabi is the language of Delhi. Some would say Urdu is the language of Delhi. Some would say Hindi, but which kind of Hindi? Some would say Uttar Pradesh language, UP Hindi. Some would say, why UP Hindi? Now there is so much of Bihari Hindi in Delhi. So, the truth is something very different from what it was, let us say, 100 years ago. 100 years ago, Delhi was a very different city, the population was very different, the speakers of the language were very different. Today, the reality is what I have just mentioned. So, where do you go from here? The result of this is that the identity question is always something which is imagined and not based upon the truth. So this is the emerging reality of urban India today. And I think now almost 40% of Indian population or 35% of Indian population lives in cities, big cities, small cities or very small cities. So it's a very different kind of reality that you see. If you look upon this thing, then what you find that the politics of India is already an unreal politics. So let me mention Bombay. Bombay is considered to be a city of the Marathi speaking people, Maharashtra. But then how many Marathis are there? Are they 80%? Are they 70% or are they 50%? I'm sure that the reality is something very different from what any chief minister of Maharashtra would imagine when he would think of Bombay as a city belonging to Maharashtra. So if your biggest city is no longer a Maratha city or a Maratha speaking place, or in any situation if there are 40% people in it who are speaking non-Marathi, then are you justified in calling it a Maratha city or a Maharashtrian city? Are you justified in calling somebody like Kangana Ranaut as an outsider? I'm just giving you one small indication about the kind of debates that are taking place and the perversions that we are going into. I don't want to go into details or give you many more examples, because what I have indicated is something you understand very well. That when our leaders, when a chief minister of any state claims that the state belongs to such and such language speakers, then how false that claim is, how untenable that claim is. And in the last 10 years, it has become an untenable claim in almost every part of India. Then, this situation is going to grow in the direction that I have talked about. The whole identity would only be an identity on paper. In reality, it would be different. Because we have laws, because we have people living and thinking about themselves in such a unreal manner, we have all kinds of conflicts. And we have all kinds of identity problems and distribution of various so-called rights of the people. For instance, admission to educational institutions, the quotas, people demanding different kinds of quotas on linguistic basis. There was, I think, a move to reserve a certain amount of jobs for the Marathi people in Maharashtra. And the court, I think, struck it off. The whole thing is still sub judice, I believe. In any case, it is still a matter of dispute. Now, these kinds of disputes are constantly multiplying. So, one has to look about the question of language in a very different manner. And if you are going to look upon it in a very different manner, then what way would you work it out? How will you change the identity of a present-day linguistic state into something different? So as I asked you the question, how will you come out of this conundrum? Would you make it a state in which there are 4 languages as the state language? And if you are going to do that, then every state of India has 3 languages or 4 languages. Then will you be able to divide one state from another into any kind of a sensible manner? For instance, if Karnataka is going to have Marathi, Telugu and Tamil and Malayalam as 5 languages, and if Tamil Nadu is going to have similarly these 4 languages, then what is the sense in having these 3 or 4 states with pretty much the same languages of the south? Then why not go for something which existed in the British times? Like, there was a central province, then there was a Greater Bengal type of a division, and then there was what was called the Madras Presidency. because they did not make the division on the basis of the language. They made it in terms of the broader identity. Because the languages of the South are quite different from the languages of the North. And culturally there is a division among the people also since very ancient times. We always call the people of the South as Dakshinatyaha. That is those who belong to the South. So, the southern people calling people of the North as Northies and northerners calling them as Southees need not always be with a loaded meaning. It can just be with something very factual. So should we go to that kind of a model? And if we go to that kind of a model, would that give us certain advantages? Now that is a question that I want you to ponder. Now in my mind, I think that there will be a certain advantage in redividing the Indian state. And that would be that the kind of very narrow identities which we have constructed would start to disappear. And the kind of divisions which we do in terms of jobs, in terms of local politics, and politics that eventually goes into some kind of a caste politics, would also cease. You see, when you have a wider perspective and when you have a larger number of parameters which are struggling for power or being recognized, then the whole situation changes. And when this changes, then the identities have to be redefined. The identities would then be broader identities. People would learn more languages. I think the biggest advantage would be that today the average Indian is so constricted in his or her approach by the linguistic identity that they think of themselves as Tamilians, Maharashtrians or Hindiwalas or Bengalis, etc. And that would undergo a radical change. This does not mean that you would be any less proud of the language which you are speaking, either from childhood or which you may have adopted at a later age in your life. You would love that language, you have grown up with that language, you would still have the same attachment with what you now call the mother tongue. And you would do all those things, but I think your identity would not be restricted to this language, as was in the past before 19th century. This would be one big advantage. And that would also make you open to rest of the country. To begin with, people will start adopting a very practical use towards the language, not the attitude of entitlement. You see, today we have this expectation of entitlement. I say, look, I am a Tamilian. So from class 1, my child should be taught in Tamil. He or she should be taught the mother tongue. That should be the preferential language. And the same works for Hindi or the same works for Marathi and etc. Now if your identity is then looked upon differently, that in the region you live, the state you live, the part of the country you live, there are 3-4 languages, and all those languages are equally important, and it is not an issue of majority and minority. It is an issue of choosing one of those languages. Then you will have a more practical approach. You would say, I learned this language more because this is more advantageous. I learned this language because it provides me such and such skill, or that I like certain things in this language more, or that I can travel with this language to other parts of the country. We already have that kind of fascination for English, don't we? I mean, it is something which has kept the hegemony of English alive for the last more than 70 years since independence, 75 years. The hegemony of the English language is because of some kind of a romantic fascination with the language, that it is not only the language of power, not only the language of the governing elite, but it is also the language which can take us to the outer world. As Nehru said, window to the outer world. Of course, the window has become a huge hole in the roof, and everything from outside through English is now drowning whatever is there in our Indian homes. But then that is the fascination, because you do find a few things practical. So similarly, if your attachment with your very local language goes away, and you take a more rational approach to it, then the country would look upon language as a whole in less emotive manner and more practical manner. You will judge how to use a language, for what to use a language, and you will also learn more languages. And it is not so difficult for Indians to learn languages belonging to a neighboring state or even a little distant state, because the fundamental vocabulary of all Indian languages is still derived from Sanskrit. At least the bulk of it is derived from Sanskrit. And so you can communicate and pick up other Indian languages with a great ease. This is a linguistic fact which we have chosen to forget in our emotive attachment to the languages. So I have given you a picture of how the language issue needs to be revisited, and once we start doing that, I think many problems in India would be solved and India would become a more cohesive society. Thank you for a patient listening, and we can have questions now. Yes, your question is very typical question. You have given the example that you are from northwest part of India, so you have Punjabi and Urdu and even Balochi and maybe some words of Pashto, and of course lots of words of Sanskrit or so-called Hindi in the language with which you have grown up, or so-called your mother tongue, or the language which you speak at home, the language in which you have been thinking right from your early childhood. So if that is your language, then how do you define what should be your formal language? What should be the language you should use if you go to a court, or if you go to higher education and read a book? You see, that is the fundamental question. Because for all of us, there is a language of daily use. We want to buy a pan from a panwala, and we use that kind of a language. But if you are going to make a submission in a court of law, asking for a wrong to be set right, then it would have to be in some kind of a very standard language. Now, this is the essential contradiction that policy makers face, and which cultural strategists have also faced throughout Indian history. In India, people solve this problem by making Sanskrit the formal language, and it continued to be the formal language. A formal language is that language which can be used in the widest possible area and for very sophisticated communication. Something which can be used for philosophic expression, legal expression, giving philosophic ideas to children, raising them in that manner, talking about art, creating different disciplines in it, transmitting various sciences in it. Now, for that you need a formal language, and India chose Sanskrit to be that. And India did another great miracle, which no other nation, or rather no other region or civilization, as a matter of fact, was able to do. And the miracle they did was they formalized Sanskrit to such an extent that they stopped a period-wise growth in it, rapid growth in it. They said, let us make it frozen language, more or less, on rules of Panini and rules of various other grammarians. So that, as a result, I can read Sanskrit written by the Vedic sages today, after 5,000 or 7,000 or 10,000, whatever people think is the age of Vedas. I can read Kalidasa, whereas people in England can't even read Shakespeare 400 years ago. You know, if I go to, let us say, the immigration officer when I land up in London, and if I say, methinks thou art shining forth like the zona, he'll say, what are you talking, you fool? And if I tell him this is how Shakespeare talked, he'll not believe me. It's just 400 years. But if somebody comes into a street of Delhi, Banaras or whatever, and it comes from the period of Kalidas and he wants to communicate in Sanskrit, then he can communicate with thousands of people today who know Sanskrit in India. So you see, that continuity or that formality has been preserved. And then Sanskrit supplied this immense wealth of words to various languages over centuries. It kept supplying to them again and again. Century after century, people started using those languages. So even when you wrote, let us say in 16th century like Tulsidas, then you used a lot of Sanskrit. Even in your Avadhi, you used Sanskrit. Sometimes pure Sanskrit words. Or you use in all Indian languages, like you are a Punjabi, and you say Parinaya gaya si, shadi ho gayi na. If somebody is married, then you say Parinaya, or what do you say? No, Vyaya gaya se, yeah, but there is Parinaya also used, I have heard it, by Punjabis for marriage. Yeah, it is, I have, Yeah, but okay, then if you say Vyaha, then that is from Sanskrit Vivaha. If you say parinayasi, then that is from parinay. My point is that the vocabulary of Sanskrit is constantly continuing in the largest area of India, in nearly all in all the languages that are used, including Tamil. This is the point I am making. So now just a minute please, let me complete. My answer to your question is that your language is not one language, or for that matter, anybody's language in India is not just one language. It has to be 3 or 4 languages for different purposes. When you are at a home with your family, with your people, then you are going to use one language. When you are, let us say, in a university, you will use a slightly or a very different language. When you are in a court of law, then you would have to use another language. Now, if people understand that, then most of the problems of the language conflicts would come to an end. Now, this is the point that I am trying to make. So when somebody says, give up Urdu, now that does not mean that you should discard Persian words. But when you use a certain formal dialect, then you will use words in which maybe there are some Urdu words also, but they would fall in a certain pattern or in a certain amount or a certain quantity. Because when you make a formal language, you make that artificial choice. So if you look upon this diversity of usage, then you would be able to reconcile with the truth. But so long as we say my language, and we think that my language should be the language of the home, or the simple home, then we enter into conflict. Once we accept the fact that we are going to use multiple languages for multiple purposes, we'll have no problem. So if we are prepared to look out of the window of the railway train and see that, okay, now I am in this part of India and this is what would be written in that script or in 4 or 5 languages, and it is not in what I have been speaking since childhood, then it's fine. But when I say no, I want my language everywhere, then it would be a problem. देखिए, I think Poonam ji has very practically reinstated what I was trying to put theoretically. उन्होंने बड़े practical wisdom से उस चीज़ को रख दिया कि utility, जो सबसे पहली चीज़ है भाषा के लिए, वो है प्रयोग. तो जैसे इन्होंने कहा, हम जहाँ गए हमने वहाँ की जुबान अपनाई, उसका प्रयोग किया और उसके अंदर कम्युनिकेट किया. अब ये बात मैंने आपको बताया कि ये प्राचीन काल से भारत का तरीका रहा है, और हमारे नाटकों में, हमारे लिटरेचर में ये बराबर था, इंटरचेंज एक रीजन से दूसरे रीजन में. और हम लोग रीजन के ऊपर सिर्फ लैंग्वेज का नाम रखते थे और उसको इस्तेमाल करते थे. और इसके साथ साथ जो दूसरी चीज होती है कि आपको कुछ चीज तो एक बहुत बड़े रीजन में भी स्टैंडर्डाइज भी चाहिए, उसके लिए संस्कृत का प्रयोग हुआ. जैसे अब आप अंग्रेजी के लिए कह रहे हैं, तो अंग्रेजी का प्रयोग आज सारी दुनिया में क्यों हो रहा है? क्योंकि दुनिया को एक बहुत बड़ा वाइड एरिया चाहिए जिसमें वो कम्युनिकेट कर सकें. तो एक कॉमन फैक्टर या कॉमन डिनोमिनेटर लोग ढूंढते हैं फॉर वेरियस रीजंस. अब भारत ने अगर संस्कृत को एक कॉमन डिनोमिनेटर बनाया, ढूंढा, बनाया, और अब पिछले 5-7 हजार साल के टेक्सचुअल लिटरेचर में वो है, तो उसके अलावा हम और क्या चीज ढूंढ सकते हैं अपने अपने इस लैंड के लिए, अपने इस भारत के लिए? तो एक ही वो स्टैंडर्डाइज चीज है, एक वो चीज है जो सारी पूरे नेशन के अंदर कहें या पूरी टेरिटरी में कहें, जिसको उर्दू में आप या फारसी में बर्रे सगीर कहते हैं और सब कॉन्टिनेंट कहते हैं, उसमें कहें तो उसमें आपको जरूरत तो उसकी पड़ेगी, क्योंकि द्वीप तो सब समझेंगे। सारी भारतीय भाषाओं में, चाहे मेरे ख्याल से कन्नड़ हो, चाहे हिंदी हो, चाहे बंगाली हो, उसमें द्वीप समझ में आएगा, लेकिन सकीर नहीं आएगा। आप समझ रही हैं बात को? तो स्टैंडर्डाइजेशन में जो लैंग्वेज बन गई है वो सिर्फ उसके लिए है। सो यू डोंट हैव टू गिव अप योर डिफरेंट यूसेजेस for various other areas, but for a standard use you have to adopt something which is a wider thing. This is the crux of the problem, and this should be applied to practical politics today. That's what I mean, in the formation of the new states or formation or the reorganization of the states. सवाल है कि हम एक भाषा में सोचते हैं तो क्या वो भाषा हमारे लिए सबसे अधिक मूल्यवान नहीं है? ये सवाल है। अब पहली बात तो मैं आपको ये बताऊं कि ऐसा नहीं है। जब आपका भाषा का अभ्यास बहुत गहरा हो जाता है तो आप उस दूसरी तीसरी भाषा में भी सोचने लगते हैं, आप उसमें स्वप्न भी लेने लगते हैं। अब मैं 4 भाषाएं जानता हूं, उसमें से कम 3 भाषाओं में तो मैं बहुत सोचता हूं, और वो चीज निरंतर मेरे अंदर रहती है। अब ये एक प्रेजेंट डे सिस्टम हो गया है कहना कि मातृभाषा में सोचो। मातृभाषा ऐसी भाषा है कि वो सबसे पहले माँ के मुंह से आपके कानों में पड़ी है, आपके मानस पटल पर वो छा गई है और वो ओरिजिनल है, उसने आपके मन में अपनी जड़ें गहरी कर दी हैं। तो ये सारा जो थिंकिंग है ये अनरियल है, और ये पॉलिटिकल जार्गन है पिछले 300-400 साल में नेशन स्टेट्स का बनाया हुआ। ये सारी चीजें जो यूरोपियन नेशन स्टेट्स ने बनाई, जो आइडेंटिटी उन्होंने बनाई, और आज की तारीख में वो इसको खत्म कर रहे हैं। आज उन्होंने यूरोपियन यूनियन बनाई क्योंकि उन्होंने देखा कि नेशन स्टेट का नतीजा ये था कि उनके 2 महायुद्ध हुए, और जब से 2 महायुद्ध हुए और उन्होंने सोचना शुरू किया कि कैसे तीसरे महायुद्ध को हम आपस में ना लड़ें, क्योंकि वही तो आपस में लड़ रहे थे ना, यूरोपियंस ही तो लड़ रहे थे, बाहर के ये कॉलोनाइजर्स ही तो आपस में लड़ रहे थे, नेशन स्टेट्स वाले ही तो लड़ रहे थे। तो जब उन्होंने ये सोचा तो अब उनके लिए नेशनलिज्म एक बहुत बुरा शब्द हो गया। तो यूरोप में नेशनलिज्म बहुत बुरा शब्द है, वो फैशिज्म के लगभग निकट आ गया है। लेकिन अमेरिका में स्टार्स एंड स्ट्राइप्स के नीचे 4 जुलाई को खड़े होकर सलूट लेना, अमेरिकन नेशन, गॉड ब्लेस अमेरिका, बहुत अच्छा है। लेकिन भारत के लिए वो कहेंगे कि नहीं नहीं, आपका नेशनलिज्म तो बहुत खराब है, और उसमें आपकी हिंदू मेजॉरिटी का नेशनलिज्म तो सबसे ज्यादा खराब है। तो आप ये देखिए, ये डबल स्टैंडर्ड्स जो कॉलोनाइजर्स प्ले करते हैं, हम उस चक्कर में ना आए। हम जो रियलिटी है, हमारे भारत की जो प्रैक्टिसेस रही हैं कि हम इसेंशियली मल्टीलिंगुअल लोग हैं, और जैसे मैंने इस अपने इस वक्तव्य के प्रारंभ में कहा, हमारे लिए भाषा जो है, कोई भाषा ऊंची नीची छोटी नहीं है, क्योंकि हमारे यहाँ सारी भाषाएं वाणी हैं, और वाणी सरस्वती है, वाणी दिव्य है। वो परा पश्यन्ति मध्यमा और वैखरी रूप में है। और वो हर जगह इस तरह से प्रकट होती है, तो हम किसी भाषा को छोटा या बड़ा नहीं समझते आए हैं भारत में। सब भाषाओं के लिए हमारे वाक एक देवी है। हम प्रयोग के अनुसार, आवश्यकता के अनुसार, देश काल के अनुसार उसका प्रयोग करते हैं, और हम किसी को अपना या दूसरे का गैर नहीं मानते, हम सबको अपना समझते हैं। जैसा अभी पूनम जी ने कहा था कि जो भी कुछ है, जितनी भी भाषाएं हैं, वो सब हमारी हैं। और मैंने अभी दोबारा उसको इस तरह से रखा, वो इसलिए हमारी हैं कि वास्तव में हम उनके हैं। हम वाक देवता के उपासक हैं, हम वाणी के उपासक हैं। तो हम चूंकि वाणी के हैं, तो इसलिए वाणी के जितने भी रूप हैं हम उनके हैं। तो ये भारतीय दृष्टि है, और इसमें किसी को दबाया नहीं जा रहा। प्रयोग के अनुसार, प्रयोग के अनुसार भाषा की चॉइस एट ए गिवन टाइम, गिवन प्लेस होती है, एंड फॉर अ पर्पस होती है। और यही प्रैक्टिकल चीज है दुनिया भर में। मैं तो अपने व्यवहार में यही सीख पाया हूं, और इसी से मैंने कम्युनिकेशन को अच्छा बनाया। Yeah, your question is, how do you learn languages which are very far off from the language that you know, and which appears to be a difficult language? Now, the very simple thing is, try and appreciate whatever it is to begin with. It's like when you're trying a new dish. It's something very different from the kind of food that you have been eating. So instead of saying, oh, this is not what I am used to, just enjoy what you are getting. And that way you will be able to pick it up. Then slowly you will see a pattern to it. In what way it is similar to many things that you know, and in what way it is dissimilar. And once your mind catches that, then you will be able to grasp that language. But I think the most important thing is to have a flair for the language, to appreciate it, whatever it is, whatever way, whether it sounds very different or if it sounds very close. So when I learned German, then it was easy for me because it was close to English. But when I learned Greek, it was even easier for me because Greek is very close to Sanskrit. But if I had, gone in to learn, let us say, an African language, then I would have had many difficulties, I suppose. So I think it is this approach that you first accept what you are getting, pick it up as much as you can, just as you try a new dish and slowly you start enjoying it and it becomes natural to you. That's the only way. My concluding remark would be that language is for approaching others. Not just humans, but birds and animals, because all living creatures are connected to each other through what is called bhava, or what is called a deeper emotional self, which contains your emotions and your thoughts, both. All living creatures are connected to each other through that. And once we realize that, once we open ourselves to that reality, then we will start discovering a corresponding bhava in others. The moment we do that, we will communicate, and that is the secret of learning a language. Thank you. Thank you very much.